Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and you're listening to the latest chapter of The Mechanical Crown, my ongoing fantasy serial. You can find out lots more on my newsletter at simonkjones.substack.com. This week's chapter is called Before the Drop. Bodies of wolves lay about him, not altogether whole. Tranton was down on his knees, panting, the sword held limply in his good hand, the blade resting on the ground. Though the rocky surface was warmer than it should be, the stormy air was still bitingly cold, and he was sweating from the encounter. He'd been in the mountains for long enough to know that sweat could kill you. The moisture spread to the furs, which then froze and lost their ability to insulate against the cold, leading to a sudden and catastrophic drop in body temperature. Exertion had to be managed, and the wolves had not afforded him the time. His heart rate was up, which was causing his amputated finger to throb. He didn't dare examine it beneath the bandages. Not yet. That could be a problem for another day. Adjusting his head coverings back into position, his face was immediately appreciative. He was somehow uninjured, but his clothing bore the bite marks of more than one of the wolves, and the furs around his legs and back had been torn. Fortunately, there was no shortage of fresh pelts to choose from, and he might even be able to light a fire within the shelter of the caravans and cook himself a meal. Luxury. Taking a moment to check for any wolves waiting for a lingering attack, Tranton hauled himself to his feet and examined the sword for the first time. He used it in haste, had discovered its secret by accident, and it had saved his life, but he still didn't understand its design or construction. The blade was perfectly sharp, despite it resting among the ruined caravans for what looked like years, possibly a great many years. It had a strength that seemed impossible for a blade formed of tiny shards and interlocking elements. The seams that he knew must be there were invisible to his eye. The grip was plain as was the guard, but as he held the blade to the dim sunlight casting through the clouds, he perceived a pattern of sorts, etching that bounced the light in a different manner. It was subtle, but it was there. What seemed to be abstract patterns began to look more like illustrations. Perhaps a figure or a mountain, something to examine another time if he ever found himself somewhere more hospitable. He saw now a clasp near the guard, which concealed a single switch. He changed its position, holding the sword at arm's length. Nothing happened. He flicked the switch back and forth, prompting no response. Loosening his hand, he examined the grip itself, looking for any other controls, and was startled by the blade abruptly fracturing and retracting into the hilt. Taking a firm hold again, he watched with some glee as the blade telescoped back into position. It responded to his holding. Moving the switch to its opposite setting, he loosened his grip again. Nothing. A lock or safety, perhaps. Adjusting it again, the blade concertinaed away. Tranton looked to the body of the nearest wolf. Clever little thing, eh? Carefully locking the mechanism, he clipped the hilt to a belt, somewhat distrusting of the switch's efficacy. There was nothing else of interest in the chest, so he retrieved his dropped hunting knife, which had served him well for months, but now seemed a little diminished in comparison to an impossibly engineered mechanical sword. Still, it would do a better job of skinning the big dog. It took hours and was worth the effort. Time was an abstract concept in the Barrier Mountains. A day's walking moved a body from one blizzard-enveloped orb of white to another, with no discernible difference. There was no treating of the skins, nothing to make the layers fashionable. The fur would keep him warm, and that was the beginning and the end. One layer turned inwards towards his own skin, another on the outside, with his coverings pressed between. Even amidst the strange humidity of the abandoned caravans, changing clothes was a painful experience, the bite of the wind far worse than that of the wolves. If carrying items was easier, if the path less difficult, he would have considered collecting trinkets from the old convoy of transports. Should he stumble upon civilization at some point in his future, they could be worth something. Travelling light took priority. He carried nothing but that which assisted him in remaining alive. The feast was welcome, as was the first properly cooked meat in a long while. Food was a constant challenge at altitude, where few plants or fruits could survive, and animals were scarce. Even when he did find creatures, lighting a fire had proved consistently difficult. For a long time he'd stayed lower on the mountain, skirting the tree line, where he could find vegetation to eat and sheltered areas to camp and cook. The route had forced him higher, and he'd been among the very uppermost of the peaks for what must have been a couple of weeks. His supplies had dwindled to the point of alarm, yet there was no scaling down the sheer cliffs to the west and southeast, and no time to return the way he'd come. The challenge was in not knowing how far he had to go, or when the terrain might change. There was no map, could be no map, as nobody had ventured this way and returned with information for centuries. Fresh water was never a concern, at least. As he pulled at the charred wolf meat with his teeth, Tranton observed how the snow darted about the edges of the patch of warm ground where he was sat, shielded by an overturned cart from which he'd acquired useful firewood. There was a boundary, invisible, across which the snow melted. On the other side it settled as normal. He heaved his shoulder against the cart and scraped it along the rocks and soil, moving it a few feet. Sitting back down, he continued eating and waited. The snow encroached, slowly beginning to settle in an area where it had previously melted, a few extra feet. It was an interesting observation, but did little to explain anything. From the arrangement and design of the various caravans and chariots, it seemed to have been a military convoy, perhaps travelling south towards the headland. They had not had a standing army for at least a century, after many ambitious and calamitous campaigns had nearly collapsed the peninsula into the sea. Their strength was in wealth and trade, factors which held sway over men far more easily than spear or sword. Leaving all of that behind had been half the point. He ate his fill and stored the rest. It would inevitably freeze and try to break his teeth, but the temperatures at least solved the problem of keeping the cooked meat safe to eat. Perhaps it would last him until he was able to descend again and escape the worst of the storm. Perhaps not. The storm eased, the wind dropping and the blizzard reducing to a light snowfall. He hadn't realised how buffeted he had been. The absence of the constant noise and pressure left him light-headed, as if the air itself had thinned. It was possible to see a distance ahead such that he was no longer stumbling blindly through featureless white. Perceiving the shape of the land, experiencing the sense of progress, of moving from one identifiable area to another, was a novelty. His sense of time returned, his clock wound up at last. The mountains had failed to break him, and now he was equipped with an automatically telescoping sword. The world had, for the first time since he'd started his climb from the terraces of the headland, paused in its determination to murder him. Days slipped by. Underfoot was a glacier, slung between impossibly steep walls of stone, somehow yet higher still than what he had presumed to be the peaks. A human was tiny, inconsequential in the shadow of the mountain. If he died, he would vanish, and nobody would know or care. The sun cycled through the sky, exchanging places with the moon. He could see stars blinking in the night, the clouds having dispersed while he was asleep. The reappearance of the sun at least confirmed that his compass was indeed still functioning, and had not been leading him astray, allaying a paranoid fear that he'd long been trying to ignore. Behind him the storm consumed the mountains, enveloping them as a white furious cloak. His focus remained in front, the ice having split before him, and dark crevasses repeatedly blocking his path. Backtracking became part of his days, searching for a safe route, and where snow had settled his progress was slow, the deceptive layer crumbling into the depths of the glacier. It was a maddening maze, with no walls, the far side visible as it curved down the mountain, but frustratingly beyond reach. It was a fractured, damaged land, as if a great claw had torn into it. More days, more nights, his supply of food shrank, and water was less easily accessed. Ahead, the endless glacier terminated at the horizon, the reflected sky blurring where it met the ice. His eyes slid off it, his brain unable to process what he was seeing. The ice below his feet inclined, and his attention was so focused on driving his tired limbs that he almost failed to notice reaching the termination of the glacier. He stood on the edge of one world and looked down upon another, a valley stretched out to the horizon, bursting with greens and browns and blues and yellows and purples. Tranton's eyes streamed at the rush of colour. There were forests, rivers, lakes, what might be a settlement, a large one, far away. From where he was perched, the mountains extended away to his left and right, falling into haze, eventually arcing around to the north. The old tales told of a valley encircled by impassable mountains, the Barrier Mountains. Nobody had made this journey for generations. In the history books, the valley was known as Lagonia, the Lost Valley, the Hidden Kingdom, the Queen's Folly, a semi-mythical place that most people thought didn't really exist. And here it was, nestled in its enclosed mountain ring, witnessed by Tranton Seldon. Explorers, heroes, adventurers, idiots, all had tried to navigate the mountains and find a safe path. None had succeeded, at least had never returned with the news. Was he the first? The valley below seemed a paradise, and he could well imagine anyone reaching it deciding to stay. In that moment he couldn't think of summoning the stamina to return. He hadn't done this for any of them. Tranton stood on top of the world. His hand throbbed, the lost finger calling from deep within the mountains. He had defeated the Barrier Mountains. They had not broken him. He had won. Another success in a long line of victories for Tranton Seldon, all for nothing without his family. Forcing his gaze to withdraw from the promise of the land below, he focused on his immediate challenge, which was finding a way down. He'd come to an abrupt cliff, where the glacier had sheared off and slipped down at least 200 feet. Scale continued to be difficult to grasp. It was a giant staircase, as the glacier continued its inexorable downward drift, a frozen waterfall descending to the valley. Somewhere below it would transform into rivers and streams. Climbing gear was in short supply, already used to get this far. There was a moment when he thought the descent might be impossible, that he would be stranded in between the two worlds, unable to go back or proceed. There would be a way. It just required finding. As with the rest of his journey, all it took was putting one foot in front of the other. Thanks for listening. You can leave comments and find out lots more behind the scenes details over on the newsletter at simonkjones.substack.com.